for a conversation around how art can depict a synthesis of cruelty and hope, in conjunction with the School of Theater, Television, and Film Production Cabaret, coordinated by faculty member Rob Meth, head of the musical theater program at SDSU. So I hope you have your tickets for this incredible performance. I heard it's sold out. All performances are sold out, so I hope you have your tickets and plans. You made your plans to go see the performance. I'm Arzu Oskel. I'm chair of Arts Alive SDSU. We are a campus initiative that supports art-centric research and project development, and we promote interdisciplinary learning and knowledge production through events and conversations like this. We would like to begin the programming by acknowledging the Kumeyaay people, traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today, and pay our respects to their elders, past and present. I would like to thank everyone involved in this amazing production, especially our panelists today, Dr. Lawrence Barron, Dr. Susanne Hillman, Dr. Annika Frieberg, Professor Stephen Brotberg. I think you will introduce them more properly, so I'm just vocalizing my appreciation, and Natalie McClure. This being our final event for Arts Alive this semester, I would like to quickly acknowledge the SDSU leadership, the Campanile Foundation, Adams Endowment, and One SDSU for their support to the Arts Alive SDSU programs, and of course the Arts Alive team, Elizabeth Allison, our Public Affairs and Communications Specialist, and our student production team for helping us putting this incredible events together and for their hard work. And we invite all our students to check in with the QR codes, if you don't mind, so we can keep track of our attendance and increase our chance of securing funds and support for our future events. And students can also sign up for the Arts Alive SDSU Graduation Recognition Certificate. And there's some information on the walls regarding that if you don't know what that is. So thank you so much. And
Willkommen, everybody. We're really glad that you're here. I'm Rob Meff. I'm the head of the musical theater program here at San Diego State University. And thank you to Arzu and everyone for making this possible, including Elizabeth Allison, Arzu, and the whole Arts Alive staff. So we're so lucky here to have this meeting the minds here of historians and practitioners of theater. And it's really very important that the cultural context of Weimar Germany and the history of what's happening in Germany is fully infused with the show. Arzu mentioned that if you haven't had your tickets yet, that it's sold out. However, if you come, we'll seat you. There's always a waiting list, so get on the waiting list and you'll be seated. All right, I'm not going to talk anything more. What I'm going to do is have introduce our panelists here. When I call your name, just stand up and give your title and position here at SDSU, if you will. Starting with Dr. Lawrence Barron. Laura Barron.
I'm a retired professor. I retired in 2012. I taught in the history department. I was the director of the Jewish Studies program for 18 years. And then for 6 years, I was the graduate advisor. And since retiring, I still write. My field is Holocaust, modern European Jewish history, and of late, the last part of my career, film history. And one of the things I do since I retired is I write a satire column in which I very frequently feature parodies, and I thought I would write an advertisement for the program that's coming up. So this is for all of you. What good is going to SDSU to study your life away? Go to the cabaret co-eds, go to the cabaret. It's not like the film bar first run on Broadway. It's raunchier and more gay. Go see the cabaret co-eds. Come to the cabaret. Come watch the fall of liberty. The Kit Kat Club is escapist. It ignores the Nazi races. What good is going to SDSU to study your life away? Please see the cabaret co-eds. Go to the cabaret. And he rejected me at the audition.
Thank you, Lori. Next.
It's difficult to follow up on it. I know Lori.
I wanted to be last, actually.
Lori always outshines me. I'm Dr. Susanne Hillman. I'm a full-time lecturer in the history department, and I also teach lower division Jewish humanities, or the Jewish heritage. And I was an undergrad here at San Diego State way back when, and I actually did my honors thesis with Lori Barron. My emphasis is modern German Jewish history, but I also have written about the Holocaust and, well, actually many other things. My interests are eclectic, and that's it.
Hi everyone, I'm Annika Frieberg. I'm an associate professor in modern European history and Central European history here at SDSU. And I'm apart from the beautiful singing and the poetry, I'm the mini-me of Lori. I replaced him after he retired as Europeanist in the history department. I'm also nowadays the graduate advisor, so there's that. Now I need to practice my singing and poetry writing skills, and I'll be there. Give me another 20 years or so, maybe. And I'm originally from Sweden. I study post-war Polish-German relations and post-Cold War Polish-Swedish relations nowadays. And so that's my profile.
Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, I should probably say I'm from Switzerland, and not to be confused with Sweden. When Annika just brought this up, in America a lot of people approach me and they say, oh, but you're not blonde, because they think I'm from Sweden. So Switzerland, not the same thing.
Chicago.
A geography lesson as well. This is great. Just so you know, those people who have to check in, the QR code is down here on this. So let me tell you a little bit how we're going to do this right now. So I'm going to introduce our moderator in just a second, and then we're going to. She's going to ask a few questions, and there's going to be a panel discussion for a little while. Your imaginations are going to be fired up by this. So as soon as you have questions, file those back in your mind, because we're going to leave 15 minutes at the end or so that we can answer your questions. So it's super important.
In case of my class, write them down, and you're going to give them to me after, and there's extra credit in it for you.
Extra credit, ladies and gentlemen. Fantastic. So now I'm going to introduce the moderator of our panel. She plays the role of Fraulein Schneider Frau Schneider in the play. Oh, Fraulein Schneider. Oh, right. You know Frau.
Yeah.
So our wonderful actress and MFA musical theater major, Natalie McClure.
Amazing doctors. I'm not a doctor yet. Well, maybe never, but that's okay. I'm going to be an MFA for another year and a few weeks. But we were so grateful and lucky to have these amazing professors come to speak to the cast of Cabaret. It was a unique experience that we don't always have as actors. A lot of times we have to do research on our own, but we got some intense, incredible information from each of these professors about the importance of the history of 1930s Germany, which is when Cabaret is set. And for my character, gleaned so much that I could take into my performance. And so I am very grateful that we had this time with each of these professors to learn and grow in our characters. So today we're going to start, we're just going to kind of go around and ask each of these professors different questions that informed us as characters, informed us as actors, that will also be incredible information for all of you to have. We're going to start with Dr. Frieberg, and one thing that was incredible for me to learn as a character, Dr. Frieberg, was about the history of even the financial part of Weimar Germany, because as my character says, she lived through a war, a revolution, an inflation where there were billions of marks for one loaf of bread that she had to pay, and it was just hearing about the history of Weimar Germany at this time was just beyond what I could imagine and find on my own. So I was curious if you could start us off by telling us when and what was the era we call Weimar Germany.
Yeah, so there, I think that works. So Weimar Germany was an experiment, you might say, a democratic experiment, which came after the German Empire, which was also a relatively short-lived state, actually. Had been defeated in World War I, but it was defeated externally. Then the Germans themselves had the opposition to a imperial state, to an authoritarian state, had grown so massive that it was replaced by the first democracy in that part of the world. And at the same time, there was also a lot of doubt, a lot of opposition to this state called Weimar. So Weimar took its name from a little spa town. So they moved the sort of center of power out of Berlin. Though as we know, Berlin still feels, to your character, to these characters, is kind of the center of the world. It was a state that on the one hand, it was very, very progressive, and I think we'll hear some more about this. Voting rights for women, liberalized in many ways. They were trying to make something different. But on the other hand, it was faced with the issues that a new untried state was, the doubt from the population that a lot of Germans didn't really believe that the state, they didn't believe that it was a good idea, they didn't believe it would work. So there's massive resistance in the conservative elites, in the military elites, in the business elites. There is doubts among people who aren't doing very well, because as you mentioned, after World War I, 1914 to 1918, Germany is run into the ground financially and in several different ways. And so for the middle class, for the working class, they're faced with hyperinflation, they're faced with enduring poverty, and they are very, very upset with this. And initially they blame the emperor, the Kaiser, they blame the state that has just disappeared. But as Weimar goes on, and it proves itself very inefficient, heavy bureaucracies, they have a hard time getting majorities for voting. So it looks like a shaky democracy. They also get upset with Weimar Germany. So by 1930, the state isn't quite functioning, and a lot of people are like, this is corrupt, this is pointless. Yeah. And as you say, a lot of poverty happening as well in this both in Berlin and in broader Germany, people struggling with making ends meet, right. Including, I think, your character.
Yes, absolutely. She has a whole
So Berlin was a very exciting place here, because then after 1924, the mark, the currency had stabilized, and there was a lot of new money in Berlin. That was also a lot of artists, a lot of art, a lot of experimental music, culture, art, architecture. And there was a liberal atmosphere, let's say. You came there for sex and champagne all night, basically. So it became known as that's the kind of tourism Berlin drew. So on top of the Berliners themselves, who's been living through hardship and, hustling to survive, you then have, on the one hand, artists coming in from Europe, metaphysicians like neo-spiritualists, if you will, like Aleister Crowley, those kinds of people, and also just people who are curious what this new party town is all about. So yeah, definitely a playground for people. So the rest of Germany is not at all in the same sense a playground, a place of liberal openness and of gay culture, but also of nightlife. All of the things you could find in Berlin.
Right, so what was the cabaret culture like at this time? I mean, you touched on it a little bit, but I'd love for you to explain a bit more.
Right. So cabaret, apparently, the first cabarets was late 19th century in Paris. Mm-hmm. And they were imported by the Germans, and they became popular during the Wilhelminian era. By that I mean the imperial era. They were small-scale music theaters that were known for their so shadow theaters, political skits. They were kind of playing with edge. So up until the early 1920s, I think, I forget the exact date now, there's censorship in Germany, right? They are pushing against that censorship in terms of nudity, in terms of sex, in terms of talking about sex, but also in terms of politics, in terms of political jokes. Now, people come into these cabarets, for which Berlin becomes quite well known, to drink, to party, to show up nice clothes, but also to find that edge between popular culture and political satire and maybe some high culture. But there's a little bit of tug of war if in terms of this high culture, because people very often get disappointed. Oh no, it's just, a lot of people being too naked. So it's a balance between different cultures, I would say. I would also say that the cabaret it's a borderland between multiple scenes and multiple culture, between working class culture and high culture, between these nouveau riche and people who don't have a ton of money, and then the artist scene who also likes to frequent these places.
Right. Yeah, I remember when you were speaking to us, we talked about the middle class and how that was kind of the difference between the rich and the poor and kind of the middle class finding their way into the cabaret. Can you expand on that a little bit more for us?
Yeah, I was talking to you about, the concept of going slumming.
Right.
The idea to go to a space where there's freedom as opposed to the space where you have to be on your best behavior and always, keep a good front and, do the right things and say the right things. I also talked about the difference between some, and so in the Victorian era, they refer to this as middle class seeking out maybe a working class neighborhood because they think, and this is not correct as you know by your characters, by the real hard life that exists in working class neighborhood, but they think they can find a working class neighborhood where they can let their hair down, let loose.
Right.
And in some ways I think that cabaret is that space for people where they go to find that space of freedom, a place of not having to watch how they perform in public, how to be a good middle-class man or middle-class woman, how to be proper.
Right.
So, yeah.
That's really interesting. We could continue to talk way more about this. I mean, you had an hour with us, and we could have had way more. But I think it would be fun to move on to Dr. Barron, just because I feel like this is a good segue into what the gay rights movement was like in Germany and the cabaret culture of the time. You gave an amazing lecture about the gay rights movement in Germany, and it was an enlightening window to the world that we're living in every night while rehearsing and performing in our show in Cabaret. And I wish we could hear the entire lecture here, but again, we just have this short amount of time. So I was wondering if you could give a smaller window to our audience here about homosexuality in the Weimar Republic and the time and how that relates to what was happening in Cabaret.
Right. Well, let me start a little earlier.
Sure.
Prussia unites Germany. Germany had been, before the French Revolution, 315 different states, just, some kings, duchies, bishops ruled some cities. It was a conglomerate. In reaction to the French Revolution and being invaded by the French, it formed a federation which had 39 states. And those states, the northern part got united in an economic union with Prussia, and then Prussia pushed unity for the entire country except for Austria, which was a competitor state. And one of the things the Prussians did was impose on all the states a law that had been part of their books, paragraph 175. And paragraph 175, I'll read it to you, forbid unnatural fornication, whether between persons of the male sex or of humans with beasts, is punished with imprisonment, with the further punishment of a prompt loss of civil rights. And basically it was defined as sexual penetration, whether it be through the mouth or through the anus, and as opposed to the French Revolution, which had abolished all laws dealing with sexuality between consenting adults. So in a certain way, it was also a reaction of French revolutionary principles. This code, at the same time, unification rapidly increased urbanization and industrialization. And Berlin grew from a city of about 800,000 in 1871 to one of 1.6 million by the turn of the century, to one of 4 million by the 1920s. And what became obvious to the authorities there was that there was a lot more homosexuality going on, even before the Weimar Republic, not because it increased, but because when you have big cities, you have impersonal places like parks and public bathrooms, nightclubs, libraries, places where people can hang out and you can meet people. And the police chief in Berlin decided it was impossible to enforce what went on in people's private bedrooms, but you could monitor these public places and arrest people who were committing acts that fit into the way the law was defined. And generally that meant lower class, working class male prostitutes, often young male prostitutes, so you were violating two things, was pedophilia and prostitution. Or it sometimes meant blackmail, because someone would blackmail someone and would expose this in the paper, and then the police had to move. And there were a number of upper class people who were charged. But the overall charging was not very large, and this police chief basically allowed gay bars, as long as they were private and by subscription, to flourish in Berlin from until 1919. So there already was a gay subculture. Out of that gay subculture was another factor in the 19th century, was the rise of scientific study of sexuality and psychological study of sexuality. And most of them that conclude, they might conclude that it was bad and you should stop it, or they might conclude that it was something you should tolerate, but they all concluded it was something that was innate, that it was biological. And that had all sorts of consequences, but one consequence, if it's biological, if people are just acting on something they are, then it shouldn't be illegal. And so you have the first gay rights movement in 1897, founded by a man by the name of Magnus Hirschfeld, who creates what's called the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, which was an elite committee of intellectuals, writers, some scientists, who petitioned the government to abolish paragraph 175. And that's the focus. The war comes, Weimar comes into existence, and it has more liberal laws concerning censorship, concerning prostitution, concerning a whole range of things. It doesn't change Article 175. In fact, the enforcement actually goes up from about 400 charges to about 700 a year. But it isn't a major thing. This isn't a country of 40 million people. It isn't a major issue. In Berlin, though, it's very visible. It becomes part of how The Chamber of Commerce promotes Berlin abroad. It's this free place and that's why Christopher Isherwood comes, and many other British intellectual writers come to partake of the gay life that in England is much more restrained and suppressed.
And Cabaret is based on Isherwood's
And
work.
Cabaret is based on Isherwood's book, The Berlin Stories. And so that's why he's there. And one other thing with this, this leads to a much more public, widespread mass gay rights movement called the League of Human Rights, which was founded in 1923. Between these two groups, though there's moves to make paragraph 175 stricter when there's a conservative, a center-right coalition, in 1929 there is a center-left coalition, and at least in committee, they vote to abolish paragraph 175. It never happens because the Depression occurs. There's a new election. The Nazis emerge. They had never been a very strong party, but they emerge as the second largest party in the 1930s election. And then this whole issue is dropped. And there's more important issues. And I think that's one of the things. Cabaret maybe creates a false impression that the sexual depravity of Berlin is what brings Hitler to power. And there certainly were people who voted on these culture war issues, but most voted because of the inflation, the depression, the instability of the government, the Versailles Treaty.
I would love for you to contextualize for us how Cabaret was a pre-Holocaust story in 1965 and today in 2023.
Yeah, well, it evolves. And so we need to talk a little bit about Isherwood. If you read the Berlin Stories, he's gay, but it's not a major thing there. He does go and live with a gay couple at the seashore in one of the big chapters. But his homosexuality is not emphasized. And there are, gay prostitutes who we know where clubs he goes to. It's not the major thing. This is picked up, the story is adapted into a play, Broadway play, and then into a British movie in the 1950s called I Am a Camera. And there is absolutely no mention of homosexuality. And the thing that offended the censors, and Hollywood had censors, what's called the production code, and Britain had censors. The censors were very upset that Sally was so promiscuous and that she was going to have an abortion. And the way they dealt with that abortion issue was by her deciding that she miscounted when she was late and she really wasn't pregnant. And so you didn't have to show that. The 1960s version is something different, but even there's very little hint of homosexuality. And you saw how the MC is dressed. He's in his tux. Is he gay? And I don't think so in there. He's this kind of commentator or opportunist who follows the political currents in the songs that he introduces. And there are songs. He's very heterosexual, the threesome song. And then you go to the 1998 version, which is really different. You saw there either I don't know how even to describe the bare-chested outfit with the suspenders, to me, which looked like a giant jockstrap. And he clearly is seen as either bisexual or non-binary. I don't know how to describe him, but it's clearly different. And that really sort of charts the progress of the gay rights movement. In the 1950s, the APA, American Psychological Society, saw this as a psychiatric, a sociopathic disorder. It didn't change that until the 1970s. And part of the McCarthy era was ferreting out homosexuals because they were seen as security risks and likely to turn communist. That begins to change with the Stonewall riots in 1969. The APA changes. Not in time enough for the movie. And by the way, the movie hints, I didn't mention the movie. The movie also hints at homosexuality, but very briefly. The character Brian, sort of late in the movie, we find out is having an affair, having a threesome with Sally's aristocratic lover. And Christopher Isherwood was offended by that. And he said, they sort of treated it like bedwetting. that homosexuality was bedwetting. It was this little sort of quirk that happened. Then you can't say that about the 1998 one, and we have a whole slew of laws starting in the 1990s, even some constitutional rulings on the equality of gays against certain laws that were being passed in states, so that you have a whole different atmosphere by the 1990s, and you can have a cabaret like this.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And your lecture was incredible about the role of Jews in Weimar Germany, and it informed my character in such a large way because of the fact that Fräulein Schneider is engaged to a Jewish man and decides to break off the engagement because Ernst comes to her and says it is not advisable, and for her, survival is the most important thing. And she realizes if the Nazis come to power, she might not survive. She might not have a license to rent her rooms, and that's the most important thing to her. She survived all of these things in her life, and that's the most important thing. So I would love for you to talk some more for us about Jewish life in Weimar Germany and describe it a little bit more for us with a diverse community.
Okay. I would like to begin by saying how the Nazis viewed, is it working? Yeah, okay. How the Nazis described the Weimar Republic. And of course the Nazis hated the Weimar Republic and everything it stood for. So they often called the Weimar Republic a Jew republic. And they criticized Weimar culture as Jewified. In their mind, the Jews played a tremendously important and destructive role in Germany. So it comes as something of a surprise when we consider that less than 1% of all Germans were actually Jews. Only roughly 565,000 Jews in Germany, or Germans, were of Jewish descent. And there's another problem with calling the Weimar Republic a Jew republic. It ignores the tremendous diversity among the population. So that's something I would like to say something more about. Jews differed in regards to nationality, because not all Jews in Germany were actually German Jews. About up to 20% were so-called Ostjuden or Eastern Jews. They had immigrated from countries like, well, Poland, the Russian Empire, and so forth. They also were distinguished differed in their religious affiliation. I would say a comfortable majority of Jews in Germany were so-called three-day Jews. That was a term used for Jews who were largely divorced from their Jewish heritage. They only remembered that they were Jewish on the 3 holiest days of the year, including Yom Kippur. But there was a minority of Orthodox Jews, and some of the Eastern European Jews who emigrated to Germany were Hasidic Jews. So they were immediately recognizable by their attire. Then there was diversity in the political realm. Some Jews, a minority, were on the radical left. And these were definitely, well, not even three-day Jews. They were so-called non-Jewish Jews. They included radical revolutionaries who played an important role in the German Revolution that Professor Frieberg mentioned. They did not think of themselves as primarily Jewish, but in the public mind, and the public by and large really despised this revolution, they were Jews, of course. So the Jews were blamed for the revolution. Many of them, well, most of the key leaders were murdered in early 1919. Rosa Luxemburg, in Bavaria. It was,
Eisner.
Yeah, Eisner. He was actually not Jewish. He's often, but Eisner, Landauer, so all the major ones of them were murdered. But that was a minority. There were also a significant number of Jews who were liberal progressives. Under the impact of the rising Nazi party, many of them would actually move in the social democratic camp. There were nationalist Jews, and actually that's in two ways. Some, a small minority, were German nationalists.
But more, still a minority, but a bigger minority were Zionists. So Zionism is Jewish nationalism. Zionists hope to establish a Jewish state at some point in Palestine. What else do we have? Yeah, that's about it. Far left, a few on the far right, many in the middle, Jewish nationalists. So here too, there's absolutely no unity. And then the Jews in culture, in Weimar culture. All too often after 1933, as I said before, the Nazis in particular would say, well, the Jews, they Jewified they kind of undermined our good, wholesome German culture. And incidentally, some of the Jews who felt, well, understandably very distressed at the rise of the Nazis and the increasing attacks on them, they made a similar argument. We Jews have had a tremendously important impact on Weimar culture. And I think we need to be a little careful here. It is true that some of the most creative and most notable avant-garde figures were Jews, but others were not. The most famous playwright, Bertolt Brecht, was not a Jew. In music, we have Arnold Schoenberg, who was very important. He was Jewish, but then again, Paul Hindemith was not. In literature, probably the most famous German writer was Thomas Mann. He had Jewish relatives, but he himself was not Jewish. So the point I'm making is that here too, only some Jews were part of the avant-garde. And by and large, I would say the majority was, they were at best cautious when it came to this flowering of avant-garde culture or the kinds of stuff that Professor Frieberg and Professor Barron talked about, because they were middle class, bourgeois. They had suffered from the hyperinflation, definitely, not quite as much as the regular population, but they still did suffer.
How the rise of the Nazi Party affected Jewish life. I mean, obviously, this is something that we see happening in Cabaret. For those of you that don't know, it's a major part of how, well, no spoilers. Let me just say that. So I'd love for you to go into more of the rise of the Nazi Party.
Okay, yeah, I would say that actually the problem already began for Jews. Well, I mean, the problem of anti-Semitism had existed for a long time, obviously. The high point of Jewish German assimilation and integration was actually before the Weimar Republic. During Wilhelmine Germany, the Second Reich, 1871 to 1914, there had been political anti-Semitism, which is the use of anti-Semitism as part of your political platform, but that kind of lost momentum as we moved closer to 1900. So the Jews began to feel more accepted in Germany. And especially in 1914, when Kaiser Wilhelm, the German leader, he made an important announcement. He said, "I only recognize Germans. There's no more divisions between socialists and conservatives, between Jews and Christians and so forth, only Germans." And then 2 years later, there was a big shock. The German war effort wasn't going very well, and so the German High Command decided to launch a so-called Jew census, or Jew count, because Jews were accused, in typical anti-Semitic vein, of shirking, dragging their feet, not doing profiteering from the war, not really pulling their weight on the battlefield. This was a rude wake-up call to Jews in Germany who had felt finally we're accepted. Again, they were singled out, and the problem was, so the census revealed that the Jews were pulling their weight. Proportionally speaking, they were fighting and dying just like everybody else. The results were not published. And so that was the first big blow. Then the war ended, and with it came the so-called stab in the back myth. Or actually, increasingly, I think the better term is the lie, because it was a lie. Jews and socialists were accused of having stabbed the German army into the back. They had pulled out of the war before it was necessary, according to the lie. In reality, Germany could no longer fight. But so these were some of the events that poisoned the atmosphere for Jews. And they kind of set the stage for anti-Semitism playing a more important role in the Weimar Republic. It was during the Weimar Republic, 1919 to 1933, that anti-Semitism became widely respectable. And I think that's the key problem here. Not so much, and this may sound strange, not so much some of the riots or assassinations, because you could always say this was, in German they call it Radau-Antisemitismus. How do you translate? Mayhem anti-Semitism? Yeah, it's sort of anti-Semitism that's carried out by thugs. You could always say, well, they're thugs, they don't know what they're doing. But in the Weimar Republic, anti-Semitism became increasingly respectable. So that was before the Nazis coming to power. But as was mentioned before, with the Great Depression, the Nazis began to gain a lot of support, mostly due not to their anti-Semitic party platform, but due to economic distress. So there were actually boycotts of Jewish-owned businesses before 1933. So I guess what I'm suggesting is that when Hitler came to power in January 1933, it was not as big of a break when it comes to anti-Semitism as has often been stated. Of course, and this is a very important point, Jews could not have anticipated the viciousness of the legal anti-Semitic onslaught. I mean, beginning with the Jew boycott, April 1933, and then, well, many, many more laws. But there was a continuum in anti-Semitism. And I think that's a point that has often been kind of downplayed because scholars, they love to talk about what I call the Weimar myth, you know, this incredible cultural creativity. And so they have kind of downplayed that life was already precarious for many Jews in Germany during the Weimar Republic.
Yeah, it was the Weimar myth the same as the myth of Berlin? Was that tied in? Was there?
That's just my personal, I don't know, I've been concerned over the years when reading all these triumphalist accounts of Weimar culture and Jews playing a very important role. Did they play an important role in Weimar culture? Yes, they did. But it shouldn't be overstated. And I think scholars who are just enamored of this creativity and avant-garde, they have tended to downplay the fact that many Jews were, well, they were kind of not incredibly happy with it. And certainly a lot of Germans were not happy with it. And Berlin was at the center of this myth. And the majority of Jews did live in Berlin. But many of them played no part in, some did, but many did not have any role to play in this myth. This is my expression, the Berlin myth or the Weimar myth.
Do you think that Isherwood had a part to play in this myth?
Oh, absolutely. I'm actually just thinking of how maybe, well, at the time, but also later, if I may just jump forward, and it has nothing to do with Jews. Some time ago, I wrote an article on David Bowie and Berlin, and Isherwood really attracted people like David Bowie, the famous British rock star, to Berlin, because they, in their own mind, Berlin was this exciting place where Jews participated, and there was not that much anti-Semitism, and everybody could kind of live on the edge, as Professor Frieberg said. That's a limiting view, I think. So yeah, Isherwood, he contributed to it, absolutely.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, there's a moment in Cabaret where Cliff, who is basically portraying Isherwood in this show, he's in the club and Bobby, one of the performers, comes to him and says, "It's Berlin," when he tries to kiss him. Mm-hmm. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that, going off of your studies, what Berlin was like, a little bit more about the gay culture.
Well, I mean, I had mentioned even before Weimar, there was a thriving gay culture, but it was private. And what the Weimar Republic allowed it to do was become public. So gay bars that used to be by subscription or membership now became open to anybody. Mm-hmm. And so it wasn't hard. And same with publications. Though the censorship laws were very strict in Wilhelmine Germany, they basically, you could subscribe to a publication that might be deemed pornographic, and you wouldn't be prosecuted, neither would the publisher. But you couldn't sell it at a newsstand. You could sell it at a newsstand. In fact, Weimar, so liberal, actually has a law which cracks down on pornography in 1926, what they call schmutz, dirt. It's a mixed bag, but it's clearly more open, and we haven't talked much about lesbians, but there are these lesbian friendship clubs, which again pre-exist but become much more open. Lesbian magazines. I didn't talk about the Institute for Scientific Sexual Research, but this Hirschfeld founds that in 1919, creates an enormous library, but it becomes a center of gay culture because it's a place where people could meet, get legal advice if they are being persecuted. He even experimented, one of the cast members brought this up and I had forgotten, in the movie The Danish Girl. It's the 1930s, and there's this sex-affirming surgery, gender-affirming surgery that occurs, and someone asked, "Is that Hirschfeld?" And it turns out it was. It wasn't very successful, the surgery then, but so there's this whole subculture that's supportive. And one thing I didn't mention, there's another kind of homosexual subculture, which is a strange one, but actually I think it has its counterparts in America, of a hyper-masculine sexuality. It's called the Eigene in Germany, and these are people who think men are spiritually, intellectually, physically superior to women. Relationships with men are much more satisfying. Women are only there to procreate. And that had its attraction, and some of that attraction was to members of Hitler's SA, the stormtroopers. And Hitler, though the Nazi Party made pronouncements opposing homosexuality on two grounds, that it reduced the birth rate and that it led to, the Swissification, the Swissification of German men. They would not be military oriented. That's a quote from Heinrich Himmler. But Hitler said very little, because Ernst Röhm, who was the head of the SA, which was his private, the Nazis' paramilitary unit, and which aspired to be the army after Hitler came to power, Hitler said nothing because he valued Ernst Röhm, who was an openly gay man, was a member of the League of Human Rights, and got involved in a trial where someone exposed him in 1931. Hitler said nothing. When Hitler comes to power in 1933, there are all sorts of raids and they close down most of the gay bars, but the numbers of arrests don't jump spectacularly. And then in 34, when the army says, the SA says it wants to replace us, you need to choose between the SA or the army. Hitler chooses the army and kills Röhm along with many other leaders of the SA. And then Hitler starts denouncing. And then you have in 35 a strengthening of article, paragraph 175, which makes it not only illegal to have sexual, oral or anal sex, but if you look at someone the wrong way, you can be denounced. And what were maybe 1,000 prosecutions a year eventually goes up to 8,000 a year, with 100,000 people being charged over the course of the Third Reich, 50,000 being convicted and going to prison, and 15,000 going to concentration camps. And of those, 60% die. They have a very high rate because they're not only attacked by guards, they're attacked by fellow prisoners.
Thank you for letting me just make a quick comment. Magnus Hirschfeld, this pioneer sexologist, of course, he was Jewish.
Jewish and a socialist.
Yes,
boot, yeah.
And so for those who despised this Jewified Weimar culture, in quotation marks, one of the person they could point at was Hirschfeld, because he seemed to be an example of this degenerate person. And and you probably know more about this, Laurie, than I do, I'm almost certain. But I think the Nazis eventually destroyed most of his
Oh,
institute
they-
and papers, and it was a tremendous loss for the history and field of sexology, because everything he had painstakingly accumulated over the years, it was pretty much wiped out, it vanished, right? So that's, yeah.
And one thing I told this to the class when I was, the cast when I lectured to them, but one of the interesting things about it is if you look at these movements, it's amazing that they exist, but they were very tame. They wanted decriminalization. Hirschfeld didn't believe you should come out. He thought gays should keep their sexuality to themselves within their own circle. He didn't argue for gay marriage. He thought, and so did the League for Human Rights, that basically they should lead bourgeois, respectable lives. Let me just focus on the American film industry, because I know that best. In 1930, the American film industry, to prevent federal censorship, creates its own censorship organization called the PCA. And PCA forms, any of you who are interested can go to Beverly Hills to the Herrick Museum, and they have the complete collection of the PCA reports. And these are reports that are usually about 12 pages, they're forms, and you check off things. The scripts would be submitted before the movie. And if there was anything that was sexually abnormal, or crime could happen, but it couldn't be rewarded. Criminals had to pay. Women couldn't have relationships outside of marriage. If you showed a couple, they had to be in separate beds. All sorts of, and they would take these scripts and check, and then the filmmakers would have to change the scripts. And that basically prevailed. I mean, the first movie I can think of, well, after the war, there's a movie that comes out. It's originally a play called The Brick Foxhole, and it's about a homosexual who's persecuted in the army. When they make that into a movie, it becomes a Jew who's persecuted in the army. They don't want to make these movies, and it really, I mean, the first movie that I think of is The Boys in the Band, though there may be some American movies before then that deal with homosexuality, probably about how sad and how excluded and lonely the homosexual existence was. So you really don't get anything until the 1970s. And then the PCA goes out of existence in 1958. 1968, they adopt the current code of age-related. It's not exactly the same. And in 1984, that reform, and it's sort of anything goes based on what the code will allow. So.
Yeah.
West Germany was the legal inheritor state of Nazi Germany. Paragraph 175 continued to be in effect. So it continued to be illegal to be homosexual in West Germany until the 60s or so, which meant, and today is Holocaust Remembrance Day, right? Which meant that for the survivors who had been persecuted or in concentration camps because they were gay, they could not get adequate care, they could not get compensation, when there were discussions about compensation, because it was still illegal to say, well, this happened to me because I was gay. And so I think that's also an important point. Also the fact that Isherwood took this camera approach. The idea that in the places where he existed and sold his books, it was still illegal to actually speak openly about, no, this is why I was in Berlin, this was what was happening for a long time until the 60s or 70s.
And in Germany, the first movies start coming out, gay movies, by a director by the name of Rosa von Braunheim, start coming out in the 1990s. And he does a movie about Hirschfeld called The Einstein of Sex, which you can watch in its entirety on YouTube.
Oh, good to know. Thank you so much. Let's open the floor to any questions. I'll be repeating questions since you all aren't mic'd. I'll repeat any questions.
I'll ask one to Frieberg. So I have a class with you about the Holocaust, and we are right now focusing on acts of resistance. And the more common, more talked about forms of resistance are more physical. But what Professor Frieberg also talks about is resistance through art and music and just expressing yourself. in such a time of hardship and persecution. And anti-Semitism obviously is not gone. And in the past few years, it's become more rampant. So I just want to ask Professor Frieberg if, if performing cabaret at this university during this time of ongoing anti-Semitic persecution is at all comparable to how it was.
Is performing cabaret at all comparable to the anti-Semitism we experienced in the past to now?
I think the question is, so what we discussed in the class, is that resistance can be violent resistance. It can be gathering weapons and striking back, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. But performing classical music in a concentration camp, or this is one part we talked about, or satire of hated or feared leaders can be another form of resistance. And so I think that Caspian's question is performing cabaret at SDSU at a time where we see a rise of anti-Semitism and a rise of homophobia, a rise of attack on transgender people. Is that a similar act of spiritual resistance? Am I right about that? And I'm not sure, I think we're gonna have to ask the cast members and how they feel about this, and also we have some members of the Antisemitism Task Force. But I think it could be. I think it's important to open up a space for that form of spiritual resistance.
There's also an interesting shift. The versions, you either have Fräulein Schneider and Herr Schultz, which is not a happy story, doesn't end well, and we see Herr Schultz deluding himself to think it's all going to work out. But the original and the movie have the happier story of Natalia, Frau Landauer, daughter of a rich department store owner, Jewish, dating a gigolo, Fritz, who through most of the thing we don't know is Jewish. And then at the end, when she's about to break up with him, he says he's Jewish, and they end up eloping to Switzerland. Well, they get married actually in the movie. In the earlier version, in the book, they elope to Switzerland. So it's a happy story, love conquers. We're doing the not very happy story.
Yeah, and whether it's an unhappy or a happy story, the question is, does it offer up a political message or a message of resistance?
Right.
I think that's a really interesting thought. That all of us in the cast haven't really discussed openly with one another. I think as someone with Jewish heritage, it definitely hits for me in a different way. Excuse me, seeing all of this, some of the choreography that is alluding to the rise of the Nazis at the time, my character specifically ending an engagement because she's with a Jewish man and being told that she will not be able to survive if she doesn't end the engagement, if she does marry him. Yeah, it's a big question that I'd like to sit with for sure, and definitely discuss with the cast. Absolutely.
It's so fascinating. This is such a fascinating era. I just, similarly, we brought up the topics of just the marginalized groups in general in Berlin. We talk about the support of Hirschwood and sexology. We talk about the Wilhelmian era, if I said that right, of I only see Germans. There's this outgoing support for these marginalized groups within Berlin and within Germany. And what's fascinating with Fräulein Schneider, who breaks off her engagement out of fear of even knowing a Jewish man, I suppose my question is, was there continuing support through the Third Reich, or was it simply, as soon as the Nazis came to power, was all that support and hope shut down?
Support for Jews?
Support for Jews and gays and marginalized communities. Because in Cabaret, in the story, we see the first act is very supportive. In the Kit Kat Club, we talk about, we don't even talk about it. It's a very open community. Everyone is free and happy and supportive. And then in the second act, we see that hopelessness and that fear and the realism of it. So was that, how was it so easy to flip that support to fear and discrimination again?
Can you say that one more time a little more succinctly for me?
Yeah. Oh gosh. The subcultures and the communities that supported the gay communities and the Jewish communities, the marginalized communities, how was it so easy to flip once the Nazis rose to power? And was there any continuing support for them in Germany?
How are the subcultures of the gay community, etc., how are they able to flip so easily and I guess let all of their own beliefs go in support of the Nazis? Yes?
Yeah, I would say there was definitely no longer any support. And one of the first things that Hitler did, and I think that would have a tremendously negative impact, was to basically kill the left. In the first few months of Hitler's rule, first he attacked the communists, and concentration camps were established very, very quickly. And then he went after the Social Democrats. They were eventually outlawed. And these had been the parties, I mean, they were by no means perfect, but they had been the ones most supportive of, for example, Jews. I mean, the Social Democrats, they had a little bit of anti-Semitism, but nothing compared to the right-wing parties. So there was that. The best ally that Jews, for example, might have was basically gone, incarcerated, or sent out of, or fled. And then it was fear. I think society became atomized. We know that there were a lot, I would say a significant number of acts of kindness by individual Germans. We know this, for example, from the diaries of Viktor Klemperer, a German Jew who converted and was married to a Christian woman. And he painstakingly wrote everything down that he encountered from 33 to 45. And so there were many acts of kindness, but they were almost always, I was going to say behind the counter on the sly. I'm going to be kind to you, but my neighbors shouldn't hear about it. So Germans almost immediately fell into line, I would say. There were exceptions, of course, but so the support was gone. Everybody was looking out for their own, to save their own hide. And there was a sort of a program or process known as coordination, Gleichschaltung. It was in part imposed from above, but many Germans went ahead and just expelled Jewish members from clubs or didn't hang out with people perceived as, dangerous or whatever, asocial. So they actively took part in this coordination.
Oh, I think
I'll add a short and depressing statement on human nature here. So one of the most famous books in the field of Holocaust studies is Ordinary Men by Chris Browning. And this book, of course, makes the point that people who participated, who aided in the police battalions, the Holocaust, in this particular Police Battalion 101, were Social Democrats. They weren't particularly anti-Semitic, and they weren't particularly indoctrinated to Nazi views. They also had the option to not participate. But top-down pressure, the wish to be part of the group, still convinced them, not on any ideological grounds or belief grounds, to do it. So my answer would be that when there was an open gay culture and then that was accepted, then perhaps the same percentage, or not even, but a larger percentage of people said, okay, this is the norm now, we'll go with that. And when it was censored and no longer permitted, and that was a more conservative culture in place, people say, okay, this is the norm, now we'll go with that. And that people take to quite the extreme measures, going with what's imposed on you. And in both cases, and I think Professor Hillman made this point, in terms of liberal culture of Weimar Germany, there may have been relatively few, quote-unquote, true believers. You're trying to survive, you're eating, you're going out, you're finding something fun to do. And in your free time. And in conservative Germany, where the culture went extremely in the other direction, you have people who find something fun to do, and they eat, and they try to survive, and they try to get by, and they try not to get in trouble, to be targeted by violence. And that would be my sort of really dark answer, that people are opportunists. They're not ideologists.
I'd also qualify that a little in that one of the things is this isn't a sudden thing, it's an incremental thing. So that the first acts against, official acts, not what they called wild acts, against Jews was the boycott, which wasn't particularly successful. Many Germans violated the boycott of Jewish stores. And then the passage of laws which stripped Jews of their citizenship, or not of their citizenship, that doesn't happen until 35, but of their ability to be in political offices and civil service, to teach in universities. 35, it's the stripping of citizenship. And you really don't have state-sanctioned open violence on a mass scale until 1938, 5 years. And so people become accustomed to the little thing, and then you accept the next thing, and the next thing, and the next thing, and then you're in the middle of people being hauled away and killed.
Yes.
I recently began camp life. One of the particular Nazi figures we're learning is Dr. Mengele and how he liked to experiment on twins. So back to infamous Nazi figures, were there any Nazi figures in history who had a particular interest or who specifically targeted gay men?
Were there any Nazi figures that particularly targeted gay men?
Yes.
Is that the question? Scientific experiments?
Scientific experiments, extermination camps, labor camps. Any Nazi figure that specifically wanted to make gays, they wanted to make life for gays miserable as possible.
Well, Himmler definitely gave these speeches. He ran the office called the Office to Combat Homosexuality and Abortion, linked because they both lower birth rate. But in some of the camps, there were experiments, Dr. Grenay, and these are kind of strange experiments. Most of them were to see if you could make homosexuals into heterosexuals by putting them with prostitutes, female prostitutes. There were some experiments of castration and hormone therapy, but nothing compared to what was being done to the Jews. It was basically the hell that gays faced in camps was largely a product of homophobic guards, or sometimes guards who just, were homosexual and took advantage of those under them, or of other prisoners who were homophobic. And that's why the survival rate was so poor.
In the show, I'm presenting as pretty fluid in terms of being in the Kit Kat ensemble and cross-dressing. So I'm just curious as to somebody that was a cross-dressing performer in the Kit Kat Club, if with all of this being said, if what it looked like for them to go to the club at the time, were they hiding, what did it look like hiding their costume or leaving the theater? Is there any insight on what that might look like in terms of going into that persona when you enter the club?
This is a great question, because I never knew this until I started preparing to talk to the cast. But Hirschfeld developed a relationship with this police chief who was more tolerant, and with subsequent police chiefs. And he persuaded him in 1908 to create an office to issue passes to transvestites and cross-dressers. And so they would be hassled if you went public, but if you had your little passport, the police would leave you alone. And that continued into the Weimar Republic. So it's amazing that the police, were part of this, but they were.
Yeah.
What I do want to say about the 1930s also is that the SA is a presence in Berlin at this time, the thugs, the right-wing thugs. So there's violence on the street. Now, I think in Berlin, you have more tolerance and diversity for, people that look different on the street. On the other hand, you are going to have groups who are out to target groups who look different or political enemies on the street. So I'm not sure it would be entirely safe. I think that's what you were asking, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we have violence on streets in Berlin, but very often it's political violence. On the other hand, some of these groups are also into the sort of, I don't say order and stability so much, since this is extremist violence, but yeah.
Yeah, and I would just like to add that this is probably no surprise that after 1933, transvestites, cross-dressers were thrown into concentration camps. I'm currently on a project of a far-left Jewish woman who resisted Nazi Germany, and she ended up in a Hamburg concentration camp, and there they definitely had some somewhat prominent transvestites who were thrown into the camp.
Thank you so much. Fortunately, it's 12:15, so we have to end our talk.
Yes, I'd like to, on behalf of all of us here, thank Dr. Barron, Dr. Frieberg, and Dr. Hillman. Thanks to Arts Alive, Elizabeth Allison, Dr. And we will see you, Cabaret opens next Friday at 7:30.